The bodies were already frozen when they found them. In the spring thaw of 1813, Russian peasants walking the western road from Moscow discovered what remained of the Grande Armée. Not soldiers, not even corpses in the traditional sense. Shapes, human shapes preserved in ice, arranged in postures that suggested final moments, hands reaching toward nothing, mouths open in expressions that would never change. Some were stacked like cordwood, where they had collapsed together seeking warmth. Others stood upright, frozen mid-stride, as if winter had stopped time itself. The peasants did not bury them. There were too many. Instead, they marked the locations and moved on, leaving the dead to melt into the soil with the spring rains. This was the end. But the end reveals nothing about how it began. To understand what Napoleon Bonaparte did, we must first understand what he believed himself to be doing. This distinction matters. Every architect of catastrophe operates within a logic that appears, from inside that logic, to be reasonable. Napoleon did not see himself as a destroyer. He saw himself as a builder of systems, a creator of order, a man who could reorganize Europe according to rational principles. He was, by all accounts, a genius. This is not praise, this is documentation. His mind worked with a speed and precision that unsettled those around him. He could dictate multiple letters simultaneously to different secretaries on entirely different subjects without losing thread or coherence. He absorbed maps instantly, remembering terrain features years later. He required only 4 hours of sleep. He read constantly: history, mathematics, literature, science. This capacity for systematic thought would become the engine of 3 specific catastrophes, not the broad catastrophes of the Napoleonic Wars as a whole, but 3 particular acts that reveal how administrative brilliance, when coupled with absolute power and divorce from human limitation, produces horror on an industrial scale. The first horror was legal, the second was medical, the third was tactical. Each was planned, each was documented, each was justified in the language of necessity and reason. We begin with the legal horror, because it established a principle that would echo through European history for the next century and a half. The principle was simple: certain categories of human beings could be removed from legal protection entirely if their removal served the interests of the state. The year was 1802. Napoleon had just been named first consul for life. France was exhausted from a decade of revolutionary chaos. The old structures of monarchy and aristocracy had been shattered. The new structures of the republic were unstable, prone to factionalism and violence. Napoleon's genius was to recognize that what France needed was not freedom but predictability. He set about creating that predictability through law, the Napoleonic Code, formally enacted in 1804, is still celebrated in many legal systems as a triumph of rational organization. It clarified property rights. It standardized contracts. It made the law accessible to ordinary citizens for the first time in French history. Law professors still teach its elegance. But the code contained within it a specific provision that would destroy hundreds of thousands of lives across the French Empire and its colonies. Article 1781 stated that in any dispute between a master and a servant regarding wages, the master's word would be accepted over the servant's unless the servant could provide written proof. This seems on its surface like a minor procedural detail, but in the context of Haiti it became something else entirely. Haiti, then called Saint-Domingue, had been the wealthiest colony in the world. Its sugar and coffee plantations produced more wealth than all 13 North American colonies combined. This wealth was extracted through a slave labor system of extraordinary brutality. Enslaved Africans died at such rates that the colony required constant fresh shipments of human beings to maintain production. The mortality rate was so high that slaveholders calculated it was more economical to work people to death and buy replacements than to maintain their health. In 1791, the enslaved population rose in the most successful slave revolt in human history. By 1793, slavery was abolished in Saint-Domingue. By 1804, the independent nation of Haiti was born. Napoleon could not accept this, not because he was unusually cruel by the standards of his time, not because he harbored particular racial animus beyond what was standard among European elites, but because Haiti's independence represented a logical problem within his system. If enslaved people could free themselves through violence and have that freedom recognized, then the principle of legal order, the principle that only properly constituted authority could grant or remove rights, would be compromised. The entire edifice of the Napoleonic system rested on the idea that rights flowed downward from the state, not upward from the people. In 1802, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to reconquer Haiti. The orders were explicit. They were documented. They survive in archives. Leclerc was to proceed in 3 phases. First, he would proclaim that France recognized the freedom of all previously enslaved people. This was a lie, but it would divide the opposition. Second, he would isolate and arrest the black military leaders who had led the revolution. Third, once resistance was broken, he would restore slavery. The proclamation went out as planned. Many former slaves, exhausted by years of war, welcomed the promise of peace under French protection. They surrendered their weapons. They returned to their homes. Then the arrests began. Toussaint Louverture, the former slave who had become the most effective general in the Caribbean, was captured through treachery. He was invited to a negotiation under flag of truce. When he arrived, he was seized, chained, and shipped to France. Napoleon had him imprisoned in Fort de Joux, a fortress in the Jura Mountains near the Swiss border. The fort was chosen specifically because of its climate. Toussaint, who had spent his entire life in tropical Haiti, was placed in an unheated cell in one of the coldest regions of France. He was given inadequate clothing. His food rations were reduced. He was denied medical care. He died there in April 1803, likely from pneumonia combined with malnutrition. This was not accidental cruelty. This was administrative murder. The conditions of his imprisonment were designed to kill him without the messiness of an execution. Napoleon understood that making Toussaint a martyr through public execution would create a symbol for resistance. Better to let him die quietly, forgotten, frozen in a cell where no one could hear him. But Toussaint's death did not end resist. It intensified it. The Haitian forces, now led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, fought with the desperation of people who understood exactly what French victory would mean. They had seen the orders. They knew that surrender meant re-enslavement. They knew that re-enslavement, given the revenge that French forces would exact, meant death. The question that begins to emerge here, the question that should unsettle anyone examining these events, is this: why did Napoleon commit such enormous resources to reconquering Haiti when France was surrounded by hostile powers in Europe? The answer reveals the systematic nature of his thinking. Haiti was not about Haiti. Haiti was about the principle of order. If formerly enslaved people could successfully establish their own nation, the entire colonial system, the system that funded European military power, that provided the sugar and coffee and cotton that fueled European economies, would be revealed as vulnerable. Napoleon was willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of French soldiers to preserve that system, and sacrifice them he did. General Leclerc arrived with an army of approximately 40,000 men. Within a year, 35,000 of them were dead. Yellow fever killed most of them. Combat killed the rest. Leclerc himself died of fever in November 1802, but before he died, Leclerc enacted the third phase of Napoleon's plan. Slavery was formally restored in the French Caribbean in May 1802. Not just in Haiti, where it would prove impossible to enforce, but in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and French Guiana. The restoration was not merely legal, it was violent. In Guadeloupe, French forces under General Antoine Richepince hunted down former slaves who had been living as free people for nearly a decade. The French did not take prisoners. They executed captured rebels immediately, often by drowning them in large groups off the coast. The numbers are uncertain, but estimates suggest between 10 and 15,000 people were killed in Guadeloupe alone during the reimposition of slavery. This is the first horror. Not the killing itself. European powers had been killing colonial subjects for centuries. The horror is the systematic legal architecture that made the killing administratively routine. Napoleon created a category, rebellious colonial subjects, and then removed that category from the protection of law. Once removed from law, these people could be disposed of according to administrative convenience. No trials, no records, just elimination. The principle would be used again. Different nations, different centuries, different victims, but the same structure: identify a category, remove legal protection, proceed with administrative efficiency. We must pause here and consider a question that will become relevant as this narrative develops. What separates a military commander from a mass murderer? The answer cannot simply be legality. Napoleon's actions in Haiti were legal under French law. He was the sour CE of French law. The answer cannot be scale. Plenty of military commanders have killed thousands without being considered criminals. The answer appears to be intent combined with method. Napoleon did not kill Haitians in combat, though combat certainly occurred. He created a system designed to make their deaths inevitable, and then documented that system in legal code and military orders. This distinction will matter when we examine the second horror. But first we must understand how the Haitian campaign ended. It ended in complete French defeat. By late 1803, the remaining French forces, decimated by disease and combat, evacuated Haiti. The independent nation was formally declared on January 1, 1804. Dessalines ordered the massacre of the remaining French colonists, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people, men, women, and children. He was explicit about his reasoning. The French had come to restore slavery, and anyone who would support that system had to be eliminated to prevent future attempts at reconquest. This massacre is often taught in history classes as evidence of revolutionary excess, but it occurs in a context. The context is Napoleon's systematic attempt to restore a system of racialized slavery through military force and legal architecture. Dessalines was not a philosopher. He was a former slave who understood that half measures would guarantee destruction. He was proven correct. Haiti would face economic isolation, diplomatic ostracism, and French demands for reparations that would cripple the nation for more than a century. But it would remain independent. Napoleon never spoke publicly about Haiti again, but the legal principles he established there, the idea that certain categories of people could be removed from legal protection in service of state interests, remained embedded in French law. We turn now to the second horror, the medical horror. The year is 1799. Napoleon is not yet emperor. He is a successful general returning from a failed campaign in Egypt. The Egyptian expedition had been sold to the French government as a strategic masterstroke that would threaten British trade routes to India. In reality, it had been a disaster. The French fleet had been destroyed by Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's army was trapped in the Middle East, slowly being ground down by disease, heat, and Ottoman forces. But Napoleon had learned something in Egypt, something that would shape his thinking about medicine, disease, and human life. He had learned that disease could be managed through ruthlessness. In March 1799, Napoleon's army besieged the city of Jaffa, in what is now Israel. The city fell after relatively brief resistance. What happened next is documented in multiple sources, though the exact sequence of events remains debated. Approximately 4,000 Turkish and Albanian soldiers surrendered. Under the customs of warfare at the time, they should have been taken as prisoners. But Napoleon had a problem. He could feed 4,000 prisoners. He could not guard them effectively. He could not transport them. His army was already stretched beyond its logistical capacity. Napoleon gave an order. The prisoners were to be executed. Over the course of 2 days, French soldiers marched the prisoners in groups to the beach and shot them. When ammunition began to run short, they used bayonets. Some prisoners were forced into the surf and held underwater. Others were beheaded. A French officer named François Vigo-Roussillon witnessed the executions. His account, published years later, describes French soldiers weeping as they carried out the killings. They were not weeping from moral horror, they were weeping from exhaustion. The killing took too long. The prisoners kept not dying. Wounds that should have been fatal took minutes to become lethal. Men would collapse, appear dead, then start moving again. This is the nature of mass execution when carried out by soldiers who are not specialists. It is inefficient. It is traumatic for the executioners. It creates disorder. Napoleon observed this. He did not observe it as a moral failing, he observed it as a logistical problem. But the executions at Jaffa were not yet the medical horror. They were simply mass murder of the conventional military sort. War crimes, certainly by modern standards, but not qualitatively different from similar massacres throughout military history. The medical horror came immediately afterward. Bubonic plague broke out in Napoleon's army. Plague was the nightmare of every military commander operating in the Middle East. It spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of military camps. It killed quickly and horribly. Victims developed swellings in their lymph nodes, high fevers, and often gangrene. Mortality rates reached 70 to 90% in untreated cases. When plague appeared in an army, traditional military doctrine was clear: isolate the sick, evacuate if possible, and accept that a significant portion of your force would die. Napoleon rejected this doctrine. He visited the plague hospital in Jaffa personally. This visit is famous. It has been painted by Antoine-Jean Gros in a propaganda piece that shows Napoleon touching a plague victim, demonstrating that he did not fear the disease, that his courage was superhuman. The painting is accurate in one respect. Napoleon did visit the hospital. He did touch victims. But the painting omits what he did next. Napoleon understood that plague created a morale problem. Soldiers who believed they might contract plague would desert. They would refuse to enter infected areas. They would panic. So Napoleon made a decision. He would demonstrate that plague was not as dangerous as people believed. He would continue military operations normally. He would order his soldiers to ignore the sick, and he would do something else. He would ensure that sick soldiers who could not march would not fall into enemy hands. We know this because of What happened when Napoleon's army finally retreated from Jaffa in May 1799. The army surgeon general, René Nicolas Desgenets, was ordered to administer fatal doses of opium to plague victims too sick to travel. Desgenets refused. His refusal is documented in his own memoirs and in multiple contemporary accounts. He told Napoleon directly, "My profession is to preserve life, not to destroy it." Napoleon's response is also documented. He told Desgenets that he was being sentimental, that the men would die anyway, that if they fell into Ottoman hands they would be tortured, that quick death from opium was mercy. Desgenets still refused. So Napoleon turned to another medical officer, a surgeon named Royer, who was more pliant. What happened next is contested. Some sources claim Royer administered the poison. Others claim that Napoleon ultimately backed down. Still others claim that the poisoning occurred but through indirect means. Overdoses of laudanum prescribed for pain that happened to be fatal. The truth cannot be established with certainty. But what can be established is that Napoleon ordered it, that he saw medical murder as a logical solution to a tactical problem, that he believed a doctor's role was to serve military necessity, not patient welfare. This represents a shift in thinking about medicine that would have profound consequences. For millennia, medicine had operated under an ethical principle established by Hippocrates: first, do no harm. A physician's duty was to the patient, not to the state or military command. Napoleon proposed something different. He proposed that medicine was a tool of state power, that physicians should optimize for collective military effectiveness, not individual patient welfare. This seems abstract until you consider what it meant in practice. It meant doctors selecting who would receive scarce medical resources based on military value rather than medical need. It meant doctors concealing the true extent of disease to prevent panic. It meant doctors participating in decisions about which sick soldiers should be abandoned. And in extreme cases, it meant doctors administering death. Whether or not the actual poisoning occurred at Jaffa, the principle was established. Napoleon had tried to order it. He had articulated the reasoning. He had found a doctor willing to comply. The logic would reappear. In 1812, during the retreat from Moscow, French medical personnel faced impossible choices about which wounded soldiers to evacuate and which to leave behind. The ones left behind were left in the knowledge that Russian forces did not take prisoners from the retreating army. Contemporary accounts describe wounded soldiers begging doctors for poison rather than abandonment. Some doctors complied. This is documented in memoirs from multiple French officers. A surgeon named Larry, considered one of the most humane medical officers in Napoleon's army, wrote about the mercy of morphine overdoses administered to men who could not walk. By this point, the principle had become routine. Medical killing was a tool of military necessity. We must resist the temptation to judge this solely through the lens of medical ethics. Medical ethics are important, but they obscure the deeper structure. What Napoleon created was a system in which human life had measurable utility that could be calculated and optimized. A healthy soldier had value. A sick soldier who could recover had value. A sick soldier who could not recover and who consumed resources without contributing to military effectiveness had negative value. Once human life is understood through this arithmetic, certain conclusions become inevitable. The question that emerges, the question that should disturb anyone following this logic to its conclusion, is where does this calculation end? If a sick soldier has negative value, what about a civilian population that consumes food the army needs? What about prisoners who require guards? What about conquered peoples who resist occupation? At what point does the logic of utility calculation justify elimination? Napoleon never answered this question explicitly, but his actions provided an answer. We turn now to the third horror, the tactical horror. The year is 1812. Napoleon commands the largest army Europe has ever seen. The Grande Armee numbers approximately 685,000 men. It includes French soldiers, but also conscripts from every corner of Napoleon's empire. Germans, Poles, Italians, Dutch, Swiss, Croatians, Portuguese, Spanish. This army exists because Napoleon has created a system of military organization that can mobilize unprecedented numbers of men. The system works like this. Each territory under French control must provide a quota of conscripts. These conscripts are trained using standardized manuals. They are equipped with standardized weapons. They are organized into standardized units. This standardization allows Napoleon to combine forces from different regions into a single operational army. It is brilliant, it is efficient, and it contains within it the seed of catastrophe. Because a system that can mobilize 685,000 men can also destroy 685,000 men with equal efficiency. Napoleon invades Russia in June 1812. His stated objective is to force Tsar Alexander I to comply with the continental system, Napoleon's attempt to economically isolate Britain. But the actual objective is broader. Napoleon needs a decisive victory to maintain his imperial system. His empire is sustained by military success. Each victory brings territory, which brings resources, which funds the next campaign. The system requires constant expansion. Stasis is decay. Russia represents the last major continental power outside Napoleon's control. If Russia can be defeated, Europe will be unified under French hegemony. Britain, isolated, will have to negotiate. This is the logic. It is not irrational. It is simply totalizing. Napoleon advances into Russia with his enormous army. The Russians refuse to fight a decisive battle. They retreat, burning crops and supplies as they go. This is unexpected. Traditional European warfare involved armies seeking battle. Victory was determined by battlefield superiority. But the Russians are employing a different strategy. They are making Russia itself into a weapon. Napoleon's army advances deeper into Russian territory. Supply lines stretch. Food becomes scarce. The army begins to devour itself, slaughtering horses for meat, foraging from increasingly barren countryside. Still no decisive battle. Napoleon reaches Moscow in September. The city is nearly empty. The population has evacuated. Then Moscow begins to burn. The fires were likely set by Russian authorities, though this remains debated. What is certain is that Moscow burns for 5 days. Approximately 3/4 of the city is destroyed. Napoleon waits in the ruins for 5 weeks, expecting Tsar Alexander to negotiate. No negotiation comes. In October, Napoleon makes the decision to retreat. This is the irreversible moment. Once the Grande Armée begins retreating from Moscow, its destruction becomes nearly inevitable. The reasons are systemic. First, the army is too large. 685,000 men require enormous quantities of food and fodder. The territory between Moscow and the Polish border has already been stripped bare during the advance. There is nothing left. Second, winter is coming. Napoleon knows this. His marshals know this. But they believe they can outpace the worst weather. They are wrong. Third, the army's organization begins to collapse. Units that have been amalgamated from different territories begin to fragment. Soldiers desert to forage for food. Officers lose track of their men. The standardization that made the army efficient during advance becomes a liability during retreat. Men do not know who commands them. They do not know where they should go. The retreat begins in mid-October. The weather is still relatively mild. The first snow falls on November 4th. We have detailed records of what happens next because many officers kept journals. These journals were later published as memoirs. They describe the retreat in systematic detail. What emerges from these accounts is not chaos exactly. Chaos implies randomness. What happened to the Grande Armée was systematic disintegration. The army breaks down in stages. First, the horses die. They die from cold, from exhaustion, from lack of fodder. Cavalry becomes infantry. Artillery is abandoned because there are no horses to pull the guns. Second, the sick and wounded fall behind. There are no wagons to carry them. There is no medical infrastructure. Men with minor injuries, sprained ankles, frostbitten toes become immobilized and are left on the road. Third, discipline evaporates. Soldiers stop obeying orders. They break formation to search for food. Officers cannot punish desertion because they are deserting too. Fourth, unit cohesion disappears. French soldiers, German soldi, Polish soldiers, men who have fought together for years, stop recognizing each other as comrades. They compete for resources. They steal from the wounded. They kill each other over scraps of food. This is not metaphorical. French officers document instances of soldiers murdering other soldiers from different nationalities to take their rations, their clothing, their places near fires. The cold becomes extreme. Temperatures drop to 20, 30, 40 degrees below 0 Celsius. Men do not die quickly from this cold. They die in stages. First, extremities freeze. Fingers, toes, ears, noses. The tissue turns white, then blue, then black. It becomes gangrenous. Second, the body begins to conserve heat by restricting blood flow to limbs. Hands become useless. Soldiers cannot hold weapons. They cannot button their coats. They cannot feed themselves. Third, core temperature drops. Thinking becomes sluggish. Men become confused, disoriented. They wander away from the road and sit down in the snow, believing they are resting. They freeze in those positions. Fourth, coma and death. This process can take hours or days depending on the individual's health, clothing, and exertion level. Now multiply this process by hundreds of thousands. The road from Moscow becomes lined with bodies, not scattered bodies, not occasional casualties, continuous bodies. Enough bodies that the road surface becomes uneven from walking on corpses. A German officer named Heinrich von Brandt describes trying to walk the road and finding it impossible to step only on frozen ground. Every step lands on a body. Russian forces pursue the retreat, but they do not need to fight. They simply follow the trail of dead and dying, occasionally attacking stragglers. Russian civilians also attack. Peasants whose villages have been burned and looted by the advancing Grande Armée hunt French soldiers in the forests. They do not take prisoners. Disease spreads. Typhus, dysentery, typhoid fever. The army has no sanitation. Men defecate where they stand because they cannot leave the column. They drink from polluted water sources because there is no alternative. Soldiers eat their leather belts, saddles, any organic material they can chew. They eat the flesh of dead horses. They eat the flesh of dead soldiers. This is documented. Multiple officers describe finding evidence of cannibalism. They describe it clinically, without hysteria. It has become a fact of the retreat, like the cold. Napoleon himself is insulated from the worst of this. He travels with the Imperial Guard, which remains relatively intact. He has food, heat, shelter. He receives reports about the condition of the army, but reports are abstractions. On December 5, Napoleon leaves the army. He departs in secret with a small escort traveling by sleigh to Paris. His stated reason is that he needs to organize a new army to replace the one that is disintegrating in Russia. This is rational. It is also abandonment. Command passes to Marshal Murat, who continues the retreat. The army crosses the Berezina River in late November. This crossing is often portrayed as a moment of heroism, and in some sense it is. French engineers build 2 bridges under fire, allowing a substantial portion of the army to escape Russian encirclement. But the crossing is also a slaughter. Tens of thousands of stragglers arrive at the river to find the bridges jammed with troops. Panic spreads. People try to force their way onto the bridges. The bridges collapse from the weight. Soldiers fall into the icy water and drown. Others are crushed in the stampede. Russian artillery begins firing into the crowds on the riverbank. How many died at the Berezina? Estimates range from 20 to 40,000. The uncertainty exists because record-keeping has collapsed. No one is counting bodies anymore. By mid-December, the remnants of the Grande Armée cross into Poland. Of the 685,000 men who invaded Russia, approximately 120,000 return. Of those 12,000. Tens of thousands die in the following months from disease, cold, and injury. The total death toll is uncertain. Conservative estimates suggest 400,000 dead. Some historians argue for 500,000 or more. But numbers obscure the nature of what happened. This was not a battle. This was not even a series of battles. The Russian campaign involved relatively few major engagements. Borodino was the largest battle, and while bloody, it did not destroy the Grande Armée. What destroyed the Grande Armée was Napoleon's logistical system applied beyond its breaking point. He had created a military machine that could mobilize unprecedented numbers of men. But that machine had no mechanism for preserving those men when conditions deteriorated. Modern armies have retreat protocols. They have procedures for evacuating wounded, for maintaining unit cohesion during withdrawal, for sacrificing rear guards to preserve the main force. Napoleon's army had none of this, because Napoleon's system was designed for advance and victory. It had no conceptual framework for retreat. When retreat became necessary, the system did not adapt. It disintegrated, and when it disintegrated, it killed everyone trapped inside it with mechanical efficiency. This is the third horror. Not the killing itself, but the systematic nature of it. Napoleon built a machine that treated men as interchangeable components. When the machine broke down, the components were discarded. He expressed no public remorse. In his memoirs, written in exile, he blamed the early onset of winter. He blamed his marshals for not executing his orders properly. He blamed Russian treachery for refusing to fight. He did not acknowledge that he had fed 685,000 men into a system that had no mechanism for their survival. But we are not done yet. We must examine what happened after, because the aftermath of catastrophe reveals as much as the catastrophe itself. After the Russian campaign, Napoleon returned to Paris and immediately began raising a new army. This fact should be considered carefully. Within months of losing 500,000 men, Napoleon assembled another force of several 100,000. How was this possible? It was possible because the system he had created, the system of standardized conscription, training and deployment, still functioned. The loss of 500,000 men was catastrophic for those men and their families, but it was not catastrophic for the system. The system could absorb that loss and continue operating. This reveals something essential about modern military organization. Once a state develops the capacity to mobilize and deploy massive armies, individual human death becomes a statistical problem rather than a moral one. Napoleon's marshals did not resign en masse after Russia. They did not refuse to serve. They accepted new commands and led new armies. French civilians did not revolt. They paid new taxes and sent new sons to war. Why? The answer is complex, but part of it is this: the system had become normal. 15 years of nearly constant warfare had normalized military death. Families expected to lose sons, communities expected to send conscripts, the bureaucracy expected to process casualty reports. Grief was private. The state was indifferent. This indifference was not cruelty in the psychological sense, it was structural. The apparatus of the state, the ministries, the conscription boards, the logistics offices, had no mechanism for processing mass death as tragedy. It could only process it as data. How many conscripts from this department? How many horses needed? How many shoes, coats, muskets? The men who died in Russia became numbers in ledgers, and the system continued. Napoleon fought on for 2 more years. The 1813 campaign in Germany, the 1814 campaign in France. More battles, more casualties. Not on the scale of Russia, nothing would match Russia, but substantial. By the time Napoleon abdicated in 1814, approximately 2.5 million people had died in the Napoleonic Wars as a whole. This includes soldiers from all sides, plus civilian deaths from famine, disease, and direct violence. 2.5 million is an estimate. The real number could be higher. Again, the number obscures more than it reveals. What matters is the mechanism. Napoleon created systems, legal, medical, military, that could produce death at scale while maintaining bureaucratic normalcy. Slavery could be restored through legal decree. Patients could be killed through medical decision. Armies could be sacrificed through logistical failure. And in each case, the people implementing these systems could understand themselves as rational actors serving legitimate state interests. This is what we must understand about horror at scale. It does not require monsters, it requires systems. The legal architecture that removed Haitians from protection did not require Napoleon to hate them personally. It simply required him to categorize them as obstacles to order, the medical logic that justified POI. Zoning plague victims did not require doctors to be sadists. It simply required them to calculate utility. The military system that killed 500,000 men in Russia did not require Napoleon to want them dead. It simply required him to prioritize strategic objectives over human survival. In each case, normal people operating within systems produced outcomes that, when examined from outside those systems, appear incomprehensible, but they were not incomprehensible. They were systematic. This is the lesson. And it is a lesson that extends far beyond Napoleon. The 20th century would see this logic applied with even greater efficiency. Industrial systems for mass death, legal frameworks for categorizing and eliminating populations, medical experiments justified by utility calculation, military campaigns that treated human life as expendable resource. Napoleon did not invent these approaches, but he systematized them. He demonstrated that a sufficiently organized state could kill at scale while maintaining internal coherence. The people operating his systems, the lawyers who wrote the codes, the doctors who calculated dosages, the logistics officers who planned supply lines, were not aberrations. They were professionals doing their jobs. This is what should terrify us. Not that Napoleon was a monster, but that he was not. He was brilliant, organized, rational. He built systems that worked. The systems happened to produce mass death, but they worked. We return now to the opening image. The frozen bodies along the Moscow road. Those men died because they were part of a system that had no mechanism for their survival. Once conditions deteriorated, they were not killed by Russian soldiers primarily. Most of them froze or starved. They were killed by the absence of any system that valued their preservation over strategic objectives. Napoleon was in Paris when most of them died. He was warm, he was planning new campaigns. The system he built continued operating without him. And this, perhaps the final horror. That once built, these systems become independent of their creators. Napoleon would eventually fall. He would be exiled to Elba, return for the 100 Days, lose at Waterloo, be exiled again to St. Helena. He would die there in 1821, possibly of stomach cancer, possibly of arsenic poisoning from the wallpaper in his residence. His death changed nothing. The systems he created, the legal codes, the military structures, the administrative frameworks, outlived him. The Napoleonic Code remained the basis of law in France and was adopted, in whole or in part, across Europe and Latin America. The military systems he pioneered, mass conscription, standardized training, flexible corps organization, became the foundation of 19th and 20th century warfare. The logic of utility calculation in medicine would evolve and metastasize in ways that Napoleon could not have imagined. His genius was real. His systems worked. That they produced horror does not negate their efficacy. And that efficiency is what allowed them to persist. We must now examine the silence that followed. The 19th century largely celebrated Napoleon. He was remembered as a military genius, a legal reformer, a tragic hero brought down by a coalition of monarchies afraid of revolutionary change. The massacres in Haiti were forgotten or justified as unfortunate necessities of colonial administration. The plague hospital at Jaffa became a symbol of courage rather than medical murder. The Russian campaign was reframed as tragedy rather than systematic failure. This reframing was not accidental. It served purposes. For France, Napoleon became a symbol of national glory. To dwell on the horror would require confronting uncomfortable questions about French imperial ambitions. For Europe more broadly, Napoleon became useful as a cautionary tale about revolutionary excess. But to examine his methods too closely would require acknowledging that those methods were not revolutionary, they were systematizations of logic already present in European state-building. The silence around Haiti was particularly instructive. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt in history. It should have been a central event in 19th century historiography. Instead, it was marginalized. European and American historians, when they mentioned it at all, portrayed it as a chaotic bloodbath rather than a systematic struggle for freedom against systematic reimposition of slavery. This marginalization served obvious purposes. It avoided confronting the contradiction at the heart of Enlightenment thought, that reason and rights could be proclaimed universally while slavery was maintained systematically. Napoleon's role in trying to restore Haitian slavery was minimized or omitted entirely from mainstream historical accounts until the late 20th century. Why does this matter? Because silence is not passive. Silence is active historical work. To forget the Haitian dead is to suggest their deaths were less significant than deaths in European campaigns. To remember the Russian campaign as tragedy rather than systematic failure is to absolve the systems that produced it. History is not just what happened, it is what we choose to remember about what happened. And what we chose to remember about Napoleon for nearly 2 centuries was his genius. We must ask why. Part of the answer is aesthetic. Napoleon was compelling. His rise from provincial Corsican to Emperor of France is a story of almost mythological proportions. His battles were brilliant, his legal reforms were elegant, his ambition was breathtaking. It is easier to teach brilliance than to teach systematic horror. Brilliance can be admired, horror must be confronted, and confrontation requires acknowledging that the structures Napoleon built, structures that persist in modified form today, contain within them the capacity for mass death. But there is something else we must consider, something about how we understand human agency. When we study Napoleon, we study a single person, one mind, one set of decisions. This is comfortable. It allows us to believe that preventing horror is a matter of preventing bad individuals from gaining power. But Napoleon was not a uniquely bad individual. He was a uniquely capable systematizer. The horror he produced emerged from the interaction between his capabilities and the systems he built. Those systems could be operated by anyone with sufficient administrative skill. This is the uncomfortable truth. The legal codes that remove people from protection do not require Napoleon-level genius to operate. They just require lawyers, willing to apply categories. The medical logic that justifies killing patients for utility does not require Napoleon-level ruthlessness. It just requires doctors willing to prioritize collective outcomes over individual care. The military systems that sacrifice armies for strategic objectives do not require Napoleon-level tactical brilliance. They just require officers willing to accept casualties as costs. These systems persist because they are efficient. And efficiency, divorced from moral constraint, produces horror with regularity. We are living now in the 21st century. We have developed new systems, digital systems, surveillance systems, algorithmic systems. These systems can categorize populations with precision Napoleon could not imagine. They can calculate utility across millions of variables. They can optimize for objectives while treating human welfare as one parameter among many. The question we must ask is, what prevents these systems from producing new horrors? The answer cannot be that we will not put bad people in charge. There will always be ambitious, capable people willing to operate systems toward their logical conclusions. The answer must be structural. It must be constraints built into systems themselves, legal frameworks that cannot remove categories of people from protection, regardless of state interest. Medica. Ethics that cannot be overridden by utility calculation regardless of emergency. Military organization that cannot sacrifice armies, regardless of strategic objective. These constraints must be absolute, not guidelines, not principles that apply in normal circumstances, absolute structural limits that systems cannot exceed. Because history demonstrates repeatedly that without absolute limits, systems optimize toward horror, not because the people operating them are evil, but because the logic of optimization, when unconstrained, treats human life as variable rather than constant. Napoleon demonstrated this with clarity. His legal mind created codes that removed protection. His medical logic created frameworks that justified killing. His military genius created systems that sacrificed armies. And he did all of this while understanding himself as a builder of order, a servant of France, a force for rationality in a chaotic world. He was not lying. He believed this. The horror emerged. Not from his malice, but from his competence. From his ability to build systems that worked. That they worked at producing death does not mean they did not work. We must end where we began, with the bodies. The frozen bodies along the Moscow road. The drowned bodies off the coast of Guadeloupe. The plague victims in Jaffa. The executed prisoners at Jaffa beach. The massacred colonists in Haiti. The bodies are not metaphors. They are not symbols. They are evidence. Evidence that systematic thinking, when applied to human populations without moral constraint, produces mass death with efficiency. This is not a claim about Napoleon's psychology. We cannot know his inner life. This is a claim about systems, about what organized state power can accomplish when oriented toward objectives that treat human life as resource. The 19th century preferred not to think about this. It preferred to remember glory, genius, tragedy. The 20th century was forced to confront it. Industrial systems for mass death made the logic impossible to ignore, but confrontation did not produce change at the level of structure. We still build systems that categorize populations. We still build systems that calculate utility. We still build systems that optimize for objectives. And we trust that good intentions will prevent those systems from producing horror. History suggests otherwise. History suggests that horror emerges not from intention but from logic, from the systematic application of rational principles to human populations. Napoleon was a rational man. He built rational systems. The systems killed hundreds of thousands of people, not as side effect. As function, this is what we must remember. Not the battles, not the genius, not the tragedy, the function. The systematic function of organized state power when unconstrained by absolute moral limits. Napoleon is dead. His systems persist, different forms, different contexts, different technologies. But the same logic, the logic that populations can be categorized, that utility can be calculated, that some lives are worth less than others, that strategic objectives justify sacrifice, that order is worth any cost. This logic did not die with Napoleon. It evolved. It became more sophisticated. It became embedded in institutions that outlived any single person, and it continues to operate. Not everywhere, not always, but wherever systems optimize for outcomes without absolute constraints on human cost. This is the lesson of Napoleon's three horrors. Not that one man was terrible, but that systematic organization, rational calculation, and administrative efficiency can produce horror at scale while maintaining internal coherence. The people operating these systems can go home to families, they can love their children, they can believe themselves moral, because the horror is structural, not personal. And structural horror is the most difficult to confront, because it requires acknowledging that the problem is not aberration, the problem is function. The frozen bodies on the Moscow road were not killed by monsters. They were killed by logistics, by a supply system that could not feed them, by a command structure that could not evacuate them, by a strategic framework that prioritized objectives over survival, by normal people doing normal jobs within a system that treated human life as expendable. This is what we must remember. When we build systems, when we optimize for efficiency, when we calculate utility, when we categorize populations, when we pursue objectives, we must remember that systems once built operate according to their logic, not our intentions, their logic. And if that logic permits treating human life as variable rather than constant, if it permits categorizing some people as outside protection, if it permits calculating that some deaths serve greater goods, then the system will produce those deaths with efficiency, with documentation, with normal people operating normal procedures. This is the final horror. Not that it happened, but that it can happen again. Not because we will build systems intending horror, but because we will build systems intending efficiency. And efficiency, unconstrained, becomes horror. Napoleon knew this, or he would have, if he had been asked. But he was never asked. He was celebrated, and his systems spread, and the bodies piled up, and history moved on. This is for hungry historians. This is what we must remember when we remember Napoleon. Not the glory, the bodies, not the genius, the systems, not the tragedy, the function. Remember the function, because it persists. And it is waiting for the next brilliant systematizer, who will build the next efficient system that will produce the next mass of bodies, with the same logic, the same documentation, the same normal people, doing their jobs, within structures that permit horror, while calling it necessity. This is history, this is what happened, this is what can happen again, unless we build constraints, absolute constraints, that cannot be reasoned away, that cannot be suspended for emergency, that cannot be overridden by genius. Constraints that say, this far and no further. Some categories cannot be created, some calculations cannot be performed, some costs cannot be accepted. Without such constraints, history repeats, not identically, but structurally. The names change, the technologies change, the justifications change, the logic remains, and the bodies pile up. This is the lesson. This is what Napoleon teaches us. If we are willing to learn, if we are willing to look past the glory, at the frozen shapes on the Moscow road, at the drowned bodies off Guadeloupe, at the plague victims given poison, at the prisoners executed on the beach, at all the dead, all the systematically dead, killed not by malice, but by logic, by systems, by efficiency, by normal people, following normal procedures, within structures that made horror routine. This is what happened. This is what we must remember, not to judge the past, but to constrain the future, to build systems that cannot produce these outcomes. No matter how rational they seem, no matter how efficient they would be, no matter how necessary they appear, some costs cannot be paid, some calculations cannot be performed, some systems cannot be built. This is the lesson. This is the only lesson that matters. Everything else is glory, and glory is forgetting, and forgetting is permission. Permission for the next system, the next optimization, the next efficiency, the next horror. So we remember not the genius, not the tragedy, not the glory. The bodies, always the bodies, frozen on the Moscow road. Evidence of what systems can do when brilliance meets power, and efficiency meets humanity, and logic meets life. The bodies are the answer to every question about what is possible. They are possible. They are what happens when we forget to be afraid of our own capabilities, of our own systems, of our own logic. Napoleon was afraid of nothing. He built systems that worked, and 500,000 men froze. This is history. This is what hungry historians remembers. When others remember glory, we remember the bodies, we remember the function, we remember the logic, and we ask, what systems are we building now? What categories are we creating? What calculations are we performing? What efficiencies are we pursuing? And what constraints exist to prevent the next horror? This is the question. This is always the question. And history provides the answer. In frozen shapes, along a Russian road, in spring thaw melting into soil, remembered by no one except as numbers, in ledgers, in systems that continued after they died. This is what we remember. This is what we teach. This is the only history that matters. The history of what systems can do when given permission, by genius, by efficiency, by logic, by us. This is Napoleon. This is horror. This is history. This is warning. Remember.